There are moments in life when you are surrounded by people, yet something inside you feels strangely invisible. You speak, but it feels like no one truly hears you. You show up for others, but it seems like no one notices the effort you make. You exist in the same rooms, the same conversations, the same relationships, yet a quiet thought lingers in the back of your mind. Does anyone really see me? Feeling unseen is one of the most subtle yet painful emotional experiences a person can go through. It's not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet. It shows up in small moments. A comment that gets ignored. A feeling you try to explain but no one understands. A part of yourself you keep hidden because you've learned that showing it doesn't seem to matter. Over time, these moments accumulate. They form a quiet narrative inside your mind, a story that whispers that maybe who you are isn't important enough to be noticed. But the psychology behind feeling unseen is far more complex than simply people ignoring you. Often, it begins much earlier in life, long before we even understand what emotional validation means. As children, we naturally crave recognition. We want our emotions to be acknowledged, our thoughts to matter, and our presence to feel meaningful. When a child laughs and someone laughs with them, they feel seen. When they cry and someone comforts them, they feel understood. These moments teach the brain something powerful. My feelings matter. But when these emotional signals are repeatedly overlooked, something different happens. If a child expresses sadness and is told to stop being dramatic, they learn that certain emotions should be hidden. If they try to share their thoughts but are interrupted or dismissed, they begin to believe their voice doesn't hold much weight. These early experiences don't disappear as we grow older. Instead, they quietly shape how we see ourselves and how we show up in the world. The brain begins to develop patterns. It starts predicting how people will respond before the interaction even happens. If you learned early that your emotions were inconvenient or misunderstood, you might begin to suppress them. Not consciously, but automatically. You become careful with your words. You hesitate before sharing something personal. You start choosing silence over vulnerability. And eventually, the silence becomes part of your identity. This is one of the most overlooked psychological cycles. When someone feels unseen for long enough, they often begin hiding the very parts of themselves they wish someone would notice. It becomes a quiet paradox. You want someone to understand you deeply, but you struggle to express what's really happening inside you. You want someone to recognize your pain, but you've learned to smile through it. You want someone to notice the effort you make, but you rarely mention how much it costs you emotionally. From the outside, people may see someone who seems calm, independent, and low maintenance. Someone who doesn't demand attention. Someone who doesn't complain much. But internally, it can feel very different. There may be a quiet longing to be acknowledged without having to explain everything. To be understood without constantly translating your emotions into something acceptable. To have someone look past the surface and recognize the complexity inside you. Feeling unseen often doesn't come from dramatic neglect. Sometimes it comes from subtle emotional mismatches in relationships. For example, imagine sharing something deeply important to you, and the other person responds with a quick solution instead of empathy. Or when you try to express frustration, and someone dismisses it as overthinking. These responses may not be intentionally harmful, but over time, they can create distance between how you feel and how others perceive you. The brain starts to internalize this gap. You begin to believe that explaining yourself is exhausting, that people will misunderstand anyway, that maybe it's easier to keep things to yourself. And this is where emotional invisibility grows stronger. Another psychological layer behind feeling unseen is the role of self-concept. The way you see yourself heavily influences whether you allow others to truly see you. If you've internalized the belief that your needs are too much, you may minimize them. If you believe your struggles are not important enough, you may avoid sharing them entirely. If you feel like your emotions are complicated, You might simplify them to avoid burdening others. In doing so, parts of your identity slowly become hidden. And when those parts remain unseen for long enough, the feeling intensifies. You may start questioning your own importance, not in a dramatic way, but in subtle thoughts like, maybe I'm just not that interesting. Maybe people don't really care that much. Maybe I'm expecting too much. These thoughts are rarely accurate reflections of reality. Instead, they are psychological defenses formed to make sense of repeated emotional experiences. Humans have a deep need to feel recognized, not just physically present, but emotionally acknowledged. When someone understands your perspective, your brain releases chemicals associated with safety and connection. It signals that you belong. But when that recognition is absent, the nervous system can begin to interpret the environment as emotionally unsafe, not necessarily dangerous, but disconnected. This is why feeling unseen can lead to behaviors like withdrawal, overthinking, or emotional exhaustion. You might begin observing people more than participating. You might analyze conversations long after they end. You might replay moments in your head wondering if you said something wrong or if you simply weren't noticed. Over time, you may develop a habit of becoming the observer in your own life. You listen more than you speak. You support others more than you share your own struggles. You become the person who understands everyone else, while quietly hoping that someone will eventually try to understand you. Ironically, this empathy can sometimes make the feeling stronger. Because when you are deeply aware of other people's emotions, you naturally recognize when that awareness isn't returned. You notice the moments when people don't ask questions, when conversations stay on the surface, when someone changes the topic before you finish explaining something meaningful. These moments can feel small, but they carry emotional weight. Another reason people feel unseen is because they've adapted to environments where attention was conditional. Perhaps recognition came only when they achieved something. Good grades, accomplishments, responsibilities. In these environments, worth becomes linked to performance rather than presence. You learn that being valued requires doing something impressive. So you work harder, you become reliable, responsible, capable. But recognition often remains tied to what you produce, not who you are. People may appreciate your help, your skills, your support, yet something still feels incomplete. Because appreciation for what you do is not the same as being seen for who you are. At some point, the mind begins to ask a deeper question. If I stopped performing, would anyone still notice me? This question can be uncomfortable, but it reveals a powerful psychological truth. Being seen is not about attention, it's about understanding. Attention can be loud and temporary. Understanding is quiet and lasting. When someone truly sees you, they recognize the patterns in your emotions, the context behind your reactions, and the deeper meaning behind your words. But many people grow up without experiencing that kind of recognition consistently, so they learn to function without expecting it. They become strong, self-sufficient, emotionally independent. Yet even the most independent person still carries the human need to be understood. And that need never fully disappears. The psychology behind feeling unseen also involves the way we protect ourselves from disappointment. If you expect people to misunderstand you, you might stop explaining yourself. If you believe your emotions will be dismissed, you may stop expressing them altogether. Over time, this becomes an automatic pattern. Instead of risking another moment of feeling overlooked, you preemptively withdraw. This withdrawal can take many forms. Sometimes it appears as emotional distance. You participate in conversations but avoid revealing deeper thoughts. Sometimes it appears as humor, where serious emotions are turned into jokes. Other times it appears as extreme independence, where you convince yourself that needing emotional recognition is unnecessary. These strategies are not weaknesses, They are adaptations. They developed because, at some point, they helped you cope with emotional environments that felt invalidating or unpredictable. But the problem with coping mechanisms is that they often continue operating long after the original situation has changed. You might now be surrounded by people who genuinely want to understand you, but the old pattern still whispers that sharing is pointless. This creates a barrier between your internal world and your external relationships. And the longer this barrier exists, the more convincing the feeling of invisibility becomes. There is also an important psychological concept called emotional mirroring. Humans learn who they are partly through the reflections they receive from others. When someone listens carefully and responds with empathy, it mirrors your emotional experience back to you. This helps you understand yourself more clearly. But when emotional mirroring is absent, self-understanding can become more difficult. You may struggle to fully articulate what you feel. Your emotions may seem confusing or overwhelming because they haven't been validated or reflected back to you consistently. This can create an internal sense of isolation, even when you are not physically alone. Another layer of feeling unseen is the fear of being misunderstood. For many people, the deeper they feel, the harder it becomes to explain those feelings. Language can feel insufficient. Words seem too small for the complexity inside. And when previous attempts at explanation were misunderstood, the motivation to try again decreases. You begin editing yourself before speaking. You simplify your thoughts. You remove the vulnerable parts. You present a version of yourself that feels easier for others to process. But every time you edit yourself, a piece of authenticity disappears. And authenticity is what allows true recognition to happen. Without it, relationships can remain on the surface for years. From the outside, everything may appear normal. Conversations happen, laughter happens, life continues. But internally, there may be a quiet sense that no one truly knows you. That no one has seen the full story behind your personality, your reactions, your fears, your hopes. This realization can feel lonely, but it also reveals something important. The desire to be seen is not selfish. It is deeply human. Every person wants to know that their inner world matters, that their experiences are not invisible, that their thoughts are worth hearing. Recognizing this need is the first step toward changing the pattern. Because feeling unseen does not always mean that people don't care. Sometimes it means they don't fully understand how to connect with your emotional language. Sometimes it means you've learned to hide the parts that require the most attention. Changing this dynamic often begins with small acts of honesty. Not dramatic confessions or overwhelming vulnerability, but simple expressions of your internal experience. Instead of saying, "I'm fine," automatically, you might pause and share a little more context. Instead of dismissing your feelings as unimportant, you might allow yourself to acknowledge them openly. These moments may feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you're used to minimizing yourself. But they create opportunities for deeper connection. They allow others to respond in ways they couldn't before, because they finally have access to the real emotional landscape inside you. Of course, not everyone will respond perfectly. Some people may still misunderstand. Some conversations may remain superficial. But the goal is not to force everyone to see you completely. The goal is to stop hiding yourself in anticipation of being unseen. When you begin expressing your authentic thoughts and emotions, something subtle shifts inside your mind. You no longer measure your worth solely by whether others recognize you. Instead, you begin recognizing yourself. You validate your own experiences. You acknowledge your own emotional depth. You allow your thoughts to exist without immediately judging them. This internal recognition becomes a powerful form of self-visibility. And interestingly, when you stop shrinking yourself emotionally, The right people often begin noticing you more clearly. Because authenticity creates clarity. It allows others to understand your perspective, your boundaries, and your needs in ways that were previously hidden. Being seen does not require perfection. It requires presence. It requires the courage to show parts of yourself that may not always fit neatly into expectations. The psychology behind feeling unseen is deeply rooted in human development, emotional learning, and self-protection. But it is not a permanent condition. Patterns can change. The moment you start allowing your real thoughts and emotions to exist in conversations, you begin rewriting the narrative that once convinced you that you were invisible. Because the truth is, you were never invisible. Parts of you were simply hidden. And the more you allow those parts to exist openly, the more space there is for someone, including yourself, to finally see them.